Have you ever been scrolling through the various categories on Steam, hoping to find the next game that you'll buy and then put on your backlog and never play? Well, that's exactly how I discovered this criminally underrated indie game, the Muller Powell Principle. Try saying that 5 times fast. Anyway, I won't bury the lead on this one. I absolutely recommend you pick up and play the Muller Powell Principle. While I do tend to end up with a lot of games on my backlog due to impulse purchases, I found myself with a free day to play through this game, and I was genuinely surprised at my enjoyment of it. It's a relatively short playthrough, taking me, a certified gamer, about 7 hours to complete, but sometimes it's nice to have a short game that you can actually beat, instead of a 150-hour slog. My name is LemonDrop, and if you're not convinced by my recommendation alone, let me tell you why this is the best adventure puzzle game that you missed in 2023. One of the first things I noticed about the Muller Powell Principle, which I will refer to simply as the principle from here on out because honestly that's such a mouthful to say, is the quality of the presentation. Now, running on the Unreal Engine, it's not necessarily an incredible feat to make a level that looks decent. I'm by no means trying to say that game dev is easy, but with Unreal, high visual fidelity is certainly more attainable by even small indie teams, especially with an entire asset store available to flip. What is a mark of quality, however, is making a game that is visually interesting. A lot more than graphical fidelity goes into a game's presentation. In fact, there's a solid argument that can be made, and has been made, that art direction is more important than simple realism. Out of the gates, 3 Dots Games, the team behind the principle, demonstrates that they understand art direction. The principle wears its visual inspirations on its sleeve, the most obvious of which is Portal, with its energy VFX and the loading screen logo of Delta Laboratories bearing an obvious resemblance to Aperture Laboratories. The presentation also reminded me a lot of Control, bringing in darker, grittier, and more horror-themed aesthetics. And to assuage those who are not fans of horror media outright, rest assured this game never goes too far in trying to startle or disgust the player, even when it borrows from the tension of the genre. The principle dances on the line of being a thriller, all the while keeping its more futuristic and multi-dimensional aspects forefront. Now, I was going to praise them for having such a grasp on visuals for their first ever release, but despite initial appearances, the Principle isn't the first game by 3 Dots. In fact, it's actually a refinement of an earlier release called Interpoint, released into early access in 2019 under a different company name. However, it's clear that the time in between early access and full release 4 years later has not just been busy work, but actual dedication to improving and polishing the final game. Reading some of the Steam reviews for Interpoint, a lot of the complaints that people had about the game were addressed in the final release. And it always makes me happy to see an indie studio stick with the game and keep making it better rather than give up because of criticism. Interpoint definitely rolls off the tongue a little better though. Oh, and remember when earlier I said that Unreal developers have an asset store to flip? Yeah, as far as I can tell, all of the visuals in this game were made by one of the developers, who posted them while they were working on the game while it was still called Interpoint. While we're on the topic of presentation, I'll add a brief note here that the soundtrack is simply phenomenal. Composed by Vladimir Tugay, also known online as Darkman007, it ranges from eerie and mysterious to high octane, all while fitting with the overarching sci-fi feel of the game. I'm always impressed when a soundtrack fits gameplay well, especially from indie teams, and this one was nothing short of excellent. Of course, something is more important for a video game than visuals. That is, of course, the gameplay. And the most common complaints that I've seen with the Principle in reviews on Steam or YouTube come down to a misunderstanding of its genre. The Principle has the visual style of an immersive sim like Prey or System Shock, so it can be forgiven if you expect it to play like an immersive sim. But it does not, nor does 3 Dots particularly market it as an immersive sim. On the other hand, despite featuring energy grid walls and a high-tech gun that interacts with the world instead of firing bullets, it's not a puzzle game in the same vein as Portal or Cube. In fact, the closest analog I can draw for the Muller Powell Principle are games like Half-Life or the aforementioned Control. Rather than running through a series of rooms and trying to solve an individual puzzle in each one, the puzzles you have to solve are driven narratively and environmentally, where puzzles are about finding ways around obstacles to complete objectives. Now, I'm a firm believer that you should do research on the products you want to buy before you buy them. I've seen plenty of Steam reviews where people left a negative review of the game just because they didn't understand what they were buying. And that's not the fault of the developer. That's your own fault for not doing your research. If you approach the Muller Powell Principle without a preconceived notion about what you want it to be, and let it tell you its own story and use its own gameplay loops, then it won't be a disappointment to you. On that topic, the story is the main driver of this game, and I was genuinely impressed with the depth of the Principle's lore. One of the things that separates the wheat from the chaff in terms of story writing is the ability to create compelling stories beyond the immediate setting of the player. This gives the sense that the world is actually lived in, and not just a curated experience only intended for the player. The Principle has this backstory writing in spades, with plenty of world building behind every area, enemy, and ally you encounter along the way. If you want to go digging through terminals, you'll find a surprising quantity of text that will help you flesh out details of the world and piece things together even before any big reveals actually happen. Although it relies on the common old tactic of giving the player amnesia, the story that you uncover along the way has far more depth than I expected from a three-man team. Enough that I could easily see a small series of games expanding on the lore and building off what already exists. Even though the Principle itself sees you visiting multiple worlds only very briefly, much akin to Cyan World's approach to level design, there's still plenty for you to find that solidly explains each area, and plenty to build off in the future should 3 Dots so desire. Now, it's obvious from most of this video that my opinion of the Muller Powell Principle is pretty much positive, but there are still some negatives to be found. While for the most part the Principle was an enjoyable day-off gaming session for me, there are definitely parts that fell short of their goal. The forefront of these was the chase segments, which, hey, editing lemon up here. I was working on the script after playing this game in December, and while working on the project, noticed that a patch went out and it fixed a lot of the issues I had with the chase segments. Apparently, it reworked all of them. The fact that the devs are listening to feedback and adjusting the game accordingly is a massive W in my book, and even more reason I believe you should support this game. Anyway, back to the editing cave. The other area that the Principle suffers slightly is in the translation and dialogue. There are minor spelling and grammar mistakes in the subtitles, but that's completely forgivable for a small studio of 3 people in non-English speaking countries. As far as voice acting, I personally have a soft spot for cheesy lines and delivery, especially in indie works, but if
Dr. Harry Herman and his so-called selflessness.
Your disciples don't stand a chance against me, Ethan.
Couldn't it, I don't know, suck all of his quantum essence away?
I wouldn't test that hypothesis.
isn't your cup of tea, then I can understand not enjoying that side of the game. Personally, I think it speaks to what you can accomplish with a low budget, and harkens back to a time when games didn't always have the luxury of an industry of professional voice actors at their beck and call. Still, there's almost a more human connection to games that have this kind of amateurish voice work, and it's certainly better than—
You Outworlders believe yourselves so superior.
For those flaws, however, the Principle delivers a game with remarkable overall polish, a bit of replay value, and a fun world that you can easily get engrossed in. Oh, and I intentionally left this until the end here. The game is only $15 US. It is an absolute travesty that more people have not given it a fair chance for all the effort that has very evidently gone into it. Of course, I don't believe that effort alone means a game is worth supporting. You can spend decades polishing a turd. But when you can tell that that effort was put into refining the project and constant improvement, it's worth every penny. There tends to be a duality in the indie game scene, where you either have a runaway success or can feel fated for obscurity. Indie games don't get spotlights or awards very often, and even channels and outlets focused on indies tend to talk about the bigger releases, the more successful games. The Muller Powell Principle absolutely deserves a bigger spotlight, and is an indie that I can say I don't regret giving a chance, and is one that I think you should give a chance too. I don't really do reviews that often on this channel, but this was one I think absolutely deserved a video of its own. It's easy to overlook games given the continuous torrent of new releases on Steam, whether by big companies, independent studios, or, frankly, shovelware. I'm curious to know what your thoughts are in the comments below, whether you've given the game a chance and what your opinion about it is, or if there's another game that you think is criminally underrated. If you enjoyed this video, consider sharing it with your friends who are always on the hunt for new indie games to try. If you'd like to support this channel and future productions, you can subscribe on Patreon via the links below, and get ad-free and week-early access starting at just $1. Otherwise, a simple like and subscription would do just fine. As always, thank you for watching, and long may the sun shine.